Useless, pointless experiments that waste millions of tax dollars each year. It's the welfare state of animal researchers at universities like LSU. And one example in particular, the torture of songbirds, will have you singing the blues. The bird torture at LSU, next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, the ladybird torturer of LSU. What Christine Lattin does to birds in the name of science on your dime is just plain abuse and cruelty.
The conditions for the birds are really just terrible, and the worst part of it is that it's completely unnecessary to be taking birds from the wild like this and putting them through this type of trauma. We already know that they get stressed out in captivity. That makes these experiments irrelevant to wildlife preservation and conservation, and it also makes them completely unnecessary and completely based on simple curiosity rather than providing real-world solutions to the issues that wild animals face.
Dr. Ingrid Taylor, a veterinarian with PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department, will detail what's wrong with the bird research of LSU's Christine Lattin. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with friends. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you just found us, welcome. And keep binging. There's lots to listen to on the PETA Podcast. Your questions on veganism, the latest on the drug scandal that's left dead horses on the racetrack in America's horse racing industry. All that, plus frank conversations with PETA's founder, Ingrid Newkirk. It's all available 24/7 wherever you catch your podcasts. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. Christine Lattin has been researching and abusing songbirds since her time at Yale University. Now at LSU, she's published a new paper this year and looks to continue her sadistic curiosity on the stress on songbirds after she herself exposes the birds to torture. Science? It gets her and other researchers millions of dollars to fund their careers. What's wrong with it? Just about everything. I speak with Dr. Ingrid Taylor, a veterinarian with PETA's Laboratory Investigations, about the research on the PETA Podcast.
PETA has been all over Christine Lattin's case for some time, but now she's come out recently with a new article. What is her new article saying?
In her new publication, which is actually based on data from 2016, when she was still at Yale University, she is currently at Louisiana State University. In this experiment, she captured 21 birds, wild songbirds from the wild, subjected them to about 8 weeks of captivity where they were housed in single cages and subjected to stress experiments where they were subjected to stress. And she did some imaging scans called PET scans on them.
Mm-hmm. Before you go into the PET scans, well, what kind of experiments? What is an experiment that you could do to a songbird? Take away its songbook or take away its music stand? What happens? What kind of experiment happens? I mean, I'm joking, of course, but
right.
How serious were these experiments?
She uses captivity as a means of modeling chronic stress in birds. So first off, simply taking a wild animal, like a wild bird, from their native habitat, from the wild, and putting them in a cage in a laboratory, that alone is an extremely traumatic and stressful experience. That they've basically had everything taken away from them that's natural, and now they're in this completely alien and frightening environment.
Well, do they even sing when you put them in a new environment, or do they go mute, or what happens?
They may or may not sing. That actually isn't the focus of her experiments. But one thing that she does do to the birds, so she subjects them in her previous experiments, she subjected them to a lot of different circumstances that are very traumatic and stressful. So, for example, she's gone in and rattled their cages to frighten them, rolled them around in cages on a cart so fast that they couldn't perch, subjected them to physical restraint, things like putting them in a cloth bag for anywhere from 30 minutes to up to 2 hours, and then measuring the stress levels in their blood. So these types of things, basically, what she's done is once they're in captivity, she's harassed them.
This is not some benign thing to the birds, right? I mean, this is a major thing to the birds.
Right. It's like I said, first of all, they're taken out of their native habitat, and then they're subjected to these terrifying things happening to them. So yes, it is something that's significant to the birds, and they experience a lot of effects that are a result of the stress and trauma. So, for example, in one of her experiments, all of the birds lost about 11% of their body weight within like the first 5 days that they were in captivity. So for a small bird, if you're thinking of a small bird like a sparrow, 11% body weight, they don't have a lot of fat on their bodies in the first place. So that's significant. So they experience things like weight loss, decreased appetite. They show stressful behaviors like feather ruffling and beak wiping. Those are two sort of repetitive activities that birds do when they're stressed out. And these birds in captivity, they show these activities that indicate that this is a traumatizing experience for them.
She puts them in cloth bags so that can they see? Are they like just stuffed in a bag?
No, yes. The purpose of the cloth bag experiment is basically to inflict stress on them. So, and after that, she takes a blood sample from them to measure the stress hormones in their blood. So, yes, so they're put into these cloth bags. They can't see out or anything. In some of her experiments, they are put into the bags for up to 2 hours at a time, and then their blood is taken periodically. In most of her experiments, she puts them into bags for 30 minutes and then takes a blood sample.
Does she give them any injections to sort of help them, or maybe to relieve any pain from the stressful experience?
No, because the point of what she's trying to measure are the effects of the stress and trauma. So the birds don't get any sort of relief because the whole point that she's doing these experiments is that she wants to look at what acute and chronic stress are like in birds. The issue with that, though, is that these experiments just aren't relevant to either other species of birds or to humans or to veterinary medicine. And the conclusions she draws are really based more on, they can be arrived at through common sense rather than doing these painful and traumatic experiments on birds.
All right. So she takes these birds out of their environment, shoves them in a bag, a cloth bag, shakes them up, exposes them to this acute trauma, and for 30 minutes or more, right? This goes on?
Well, yeah, she's done a variety of experiments where she's kept birds in captivity and then done a variety of things, including restraining them in the cloth bags, rattling their cages, putting them into various forms of physical restraint. She's also done things like plucking large amounts of feathers from birds, and then testing the feathers. So, and that was with no pain management. So, a lot of these tests that she's doing are very distressing to the birds, in addition to the fact that they're being kept captive, and most of them are housed singly in cages. These birds are normally very social, so that's another stressful and traumatic component of these experiments.
But she takes them and she can physically bind them. That's one, or she can like rip their feathers off, or pluck their feathers and see how they handle the fact that they have fewer feathers than they would ordinarily have.
Well, the point of removing the feathers was she takes the feathers and then tests them and measures stress hormone levels in the feathers. So the birds were already stressed, and then their feathers are removed, and then the stress hormones are measured in the feathers.
But tell me, in general, when you hear about these experiments as a veterinarian, how does it strike you? The conditions under which these birds are subjected.
The conditions for the birds are really just terrible. And the worst part of it is that it's completely unnecessary to be taking birds from the wild like this and putting them through this type of trauma, especially when the conclusions to these experiments, which she has written over and over again in her publications, are something that, first off, we already know about wild animals, and that really just makes sense in terms of common sense. So basically, with all of this torture and all of the suffering that she's put hundreds of birds through, the conclusion that she repeatedly keeps coming up with is that wild birds get stressed in captivity, and we should figure out ways to not bring them into captivity or mitigate that stress, which is a conclusion that's far from groundbreaking and something that we already know about wild animals. We already know that they get stressed out in captivity. So that makes these experiments irrelevant to wildlife preservation and conservation. And it also makes them completely unnecessary and completely based on simple curiosity rather than providing real-world solutions to the issues that wild animals face.
Well, when you say curiosity, it's really the curiosity of the researcher, and it would appear from your description to be kind of sadistic in a way, almost sick, to put these little birds or subject these little birds to the kinds of trials that she puts them through.
Well, certainly it's something that's very disturbing. And especially to me as a veterinarian, when I read about these experiments and what these birds are going through, it's definitely extremely upsetting. And yes, I mean, the whole point of the experiments is to impose suffering and distress on these birds for results that make absolutely no sense in terms of helping wildlife and forwarding the goals of conservation.
How about in terms of human beings? Is there any application of these experiments and the results to understanding something for humans?
There really isn't. I mean, the anatomy and physiology between birds and humans is significantly different. For example, humans, the main stress hormone they produce is cortisol, whereas for birds, they produce corticosterone. So those are two different hormones. And there are many other differences. There's differences in the anatomy of the adrenal gland between birds and humans. And really, these results that she's getting are not comparable at all. And in fact, they're not even comparable between different bird species, because even different species of birds respond differently to stress and have different physiological reactions.
Christine Lattin has been at this for quite a while. She was at Yale. She's now at Louisiana State University. She just published a paper, and PETA has always been aware of her and has criticized her studies and her experiments and what she does to birds. And yet she still manages to get money. People still hire her.
Well, yes, she was recently hired at Louisiana State University, and PETA has been in contact with the university. I personally have written letters to the president of the university, to the Aya Cook chair of the university, who is in charge of approving these types of experiments. And basically, I've shared the information about the irrelevance of her experiments and how not only do they cause high levels of suffering in these birds, but also they just don't apply to other species of animals or to humans at all. So, and one thing that people can do when they hear about these experiments is we do have an action alert to the university asking them to no longer support these experiments. And people can go on the PETA website and click on that and help us in getting these experiments stopped for good.
Well, the big question is, why does a researcher like Christine Lattin continue to get hired by, worked at Tufts, she worked at Yale. They're, a well-respected research institutes, and now she's at LSU, recently hired. How does an experimenter like her who tortures birds, how does she continue to get work?
Well, unfortunately, there are a lot of experiments going on at universities that are just based in curiosity. They cause high levels of animal suffering. They're inhumane, and they're just occurring because an experimenter is curious about a certain process that goes on in the brain or goes on in the body and has decided to study a rat or study a bird or study a monkey and look at this process. And in terms of the oversight process where experiments like this get approved and funded, the weight is really in favor of the experimenter and not the animal at this point. And any number of experiments can get funded at this time that don't provide any relevant results to humans or to other animals, and that do cause a lot of suffering to animals.
But it makes a career, right? I mean, this is the researcher gravy train, and we're talking about millions upon millions of dollars, and not just, Christine Lattin doesn't get millions and millions of dollars, but all the researchers in toto, useless experiments funded with your tax dollars. And another question is, can any of this be derived without torture and without animal experimentation? And if even a small fraction can, that does not excuse any amount of torture or pain that's meted out toward the animal.
Right. Well, in terms of studying wildlife, there's simply no excuse for taking animals out of their natural environment in order to study them. For one thing, the stress of that act alone is not going to provide relevant data. That's already a confounding factor in any sort of studies. But there's just simply no reason to remove these animals from their environment and subject them to stress like this, when there are a lot of things we already know that are urgent issues for wild animals, including things like habitat loss, noise pollution, access to food resources and clean water. So there's issues like that need to be studied rather than doing these torturous experiments on wild birds.
Well, it almost makes one wonder if this doesn't benefit Miss Lattin monetarily, certainly, but from the grants, but somehow she gets some or derives a certain amount of pleasure from seeing these things happen, which conjures up all these thoughts of real sadistic images of mad professors and researchers and the like. I mean, is that how bad this is? Is Christine Lattin in sort of that category?
Certainly, there is a concern about a lack of empathy there with other animal species, and I think there's such a strong emphasis within the scientific community on getting published and getting your name out there and making a name for yourself that unfortunately there are experimenters that are willing to go to any length to I make a successful career in that sense, successful in the sense that they have made a name and that they're being recognized in publications and that sort of thing. But what's really lost in that equation is that there are sentient, living, consciously aware animals that are suffering and are paying the price for that type of mentality. So that's certainly very concerning within the scientific community, that lack of empathy.
And it's all exemplified by LSU professor Christine Lattin. And for her pointless experiments on songbirds, we have made her this month's PETA's Vivisector of the Month. What can people do if they want to protest what Christine Lattin is doing at LSU?
Well, they can go to our website, PETA.org, and search for her last name, Lattin, Lattin, and we have an action alert that's going to the university asking that the officials at the university stop supporting her experiments and no longer allow her to conduct these experiments in wild birds. So everyone can go on there and sign that action alert and help us get these experiments stopped for good.
These things really work. I mean, it's not like an email or a call to these universities go unheeded. They pay attention to the volume and the number of people who do express their concern, correct?
Certainly, and the more people that are speaking out about this, the more pressure that the university is going to feel, and the more that they're going to realize that these experiments are just wrong and they're not ethical, they're not relevant, they're not helpful in any way. So yes, definitely.
Dr. Ingrid Taylor, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Dr. Ingrid Taylor, a veterinarian with PETA, on LSU bird torturer Christine Lattin's experiments. Read more and take action at PETA.org. And that's our program for today. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or on ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Or my website, amok.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. At Apple Podcasts, you can rate and review the show. Remember, it helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. Thanks again for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.